He mentioned that it's within the discipline of the church. Well, not all papal elections worked that way. For instance, coming out of the Great Western Schism, at the Council of Constance, which resolved it, you had voting done by nations, okay, when voting was done by cardinals in the conclave. You had other conclaves which were strictly bound not to have any communication with emperors at the time. But they actually violated that, but the election was still considered valid. It wasn't strictly within the parameters of church discipline. Furthermore, it's an ecclesiastical law, okay, which was not the practice in the early church.
The second question now from Mr. Goley.
Okay, yeah. Looking at Luther, if you were alive back in the 16th century and Martin Luther quoted to you 10 passages, including Romans 3:28, you would not agree with his interpretation, correct?
Assuming that he's advancing the Protestant interpretation, I would not agree.
The Protestant interpretation. Okay. Now, how would you know that he was not correct?
Okay, so that's your question.
Yes.
We would know that he's not correct based on whether it conflicts with the past teaching of the magisterium, which is the proximate rule of faith, okay, or the clear and universal teaching of the tradition of the church handed down through the ages, which is known as the ordinary and universal teaching of the magisterium. For instance, the church has always forbidden Catholics to pray and take part in non-Catholic worship. That's been taught throughout history. That's why Pope Pius XI says in Mortalium Animos, the Apostolic See has always forbidden its subjects to take part in the assemblies of non-Catholics. That's the universal teaching of the church, okay?
And also, it was considered a mortal sin before Vatican II and throughout the whole history of the church if you actively participated in non-Catholic ceremonies. Now, we have these anti-popes teaching it, practicing it, giving scandal, encouraging people to commit mortal sin.
And that's what the whole directory for the application and principles of norms of ecumenism, promoted by John Paul II and approved by him in Ut Sin. It's all about praying in communication with non-Catholic worship. So I would know that Martin Luther's wrong if he contradicts the magisterial teaching of the church, okay, or the universal tradition of the church. That's how you would know. That's it.
Okay, the 2-minute rebuttal now.
Okay, yeah. I think that's part of my whole point here, is that when you had the heresy of Lutheranism or Arianism, one of the ways that there were great debates. For instance, in Arianism, the Council of Nicaea settled part of the matter, and they came up with the Nicene Creed and declared that Jesus was one with the Father, God. Here you have a situation where the Diamond Brothers take these quotes, attribute them heresy to these popes, and by their very own conclusions start a movement that's been unprecedented in the church, and they have no way to tell us when we're going to have another pope. They cite the Great Western Schism earlier, but the big difference is that there were still the method to get the pope was still in place. In this case, you don't have that. You simply do not have the method to get the pope elected, and they still have not answered that question. I still go back to that question because it's the very foundation of everything they're saying. They're saying that these interpretations of these documents or of these writings of the 5 different popes, that draws their conclusion. Well, if we can't elect another pope and we can't know when another pope is elected, then their conclusions simply cannot be true. It just simply cannot be true. Okay, that's all I have.
All right, now the second question from Brother Michael and Brother Peter Diamond.
My question is, suppose you have a man who intends to become a Catholic. This convert, however, holds to the heresy of justification by faith alone, one you made reference to earlier. He holds that justification by faith alone is no longer condemned by the Council of Trent. Can that man be considered a true Catholic while holding that justification by faith alone is no longer condemned by the Council of Trent and that its canons no longer apply?
Well, the way I read the documents between the Lutheran and Catholic documents they're not saying what you're saying. The Lutheran could not, the anathemas, the condemnations may not apply, but the truth of Luther's erroneous teaching on justification, the fact that man is considered legally justified and declared just, but on the inside is really not just, as Luther said, that is not acceptable Catholic teaching. And no, the Lutheran could not follow that teaching. But as I read the document, I haven't read it in about a year and a half, so I'm a little sketchy on that. But you can use the term faith alone, but you cannot use it if you mean it the way Luther meant it, the legal forensic act. As a matter of fact, I believe prior to the 16th century, there were Catholic priests and even some saints who used the term faith alone, but they didn't mean it the way Luther meant it. If you mean it to mean that good works flow out of it, you use the word faith alone, because if you have faith, that faith is going to produce works, then that would be acceptable. If you use it to say that man is forensically, legally just and doesn't need to do any works because God declares him just, but he's not really sanctified, then no, he could not hold that view. And again, you guys take one quote and you draw a conclusion that this is heresy, and that's the basis for your entire argument. Your entire argument is one quote or a paragraph, and you interpret it, and it's heresy.
Okay. I will note that he didn't answer the question, which was that can a man be considered a Catholic if he holds that justification by faith alone is not condemned by the Council of Trent? He didn't answer the question at all. The reason he didn't answer the question is because if he answers that he is considered a Catholic, that's a denial of the Council of Trent. If he answers that he's not considered a Catholic, he has to admit that John Paul II and Benedict XVI cannot be considered Catholics and therefore popes, because, of course, in 1999, they agreed with the Lutherans on the doctrine of justification, something I've studied in depth, and he says, this is the Joint Declaration, number 13, in light of this consensus, the corresponding doctrinal condemnations of the 16th century, that means the Council of Trent, do not apply to today's partner. That means the Lutherans are not condemned for rejecting Trent. It goes on to say that the teaching of the Lutheran churches, this is number 41 of the Joint Declaration, the teaching of the Lutheran churches presented in this declaration does not fall under the condemnations from the Council of Trent. Well, in this Joint Declaration, it teaches justification by faith alone, okay, in number 26, according to Lutheran understanding. God justifies sinners in faith alone. So, explicitly stating the Protestant view of faith alone, saying that's not condemned by Trent. Okay, it asserts other ridiculous Lutheran heresies, such as human beings are incapable of cooperating in their salvation, number 21. That's not heresy, according to Benedict XVI and John Paul II, and on and on. It sets forth the whole Lutheran program of heresy. And just so you know, here's what Benedict XVI, they both approved it, and John Paul II refers to the signing of the Joint Declaration on the Doctrine of Justification. Benedict XVI refers to the important Joint Declaration on the Doctrine of Justification, and the official Vatican newspaper talks about how the Joint Declaration on the Doctrine of Justification was signed by the Catholic Church. That's the false Vatican II Church, which officially agrees with the Protestants on justification, not the Catholic Church, which holds to the Council of Trent, which anathematizes Protestant teaching.
And also the Council of Trent, which says if you do not...
Time has expired.
Okay.